So, and therefore, with great pleasure, we welcome Rob Forsyth. He's a kind of centre top on my screen. He may be somewhere different on yours. And in a way, we had a bit of a precursor to this meeting in November when we watched the video that Rob has put together. And that served as very useful background for those of us who were able to attend that particular meeting. That can, of course, be watched on demand if you are interested. But now we have the real thing. And we're really very pleased, Rob, that you've been able to join us this evening. I don't want to steal your thunder by saying anything more about you, because I'm sure that you would like to introduce yourself in that respect as well. And we have briefly practiced earlier this week in terms of sharing the screen. So hopefully whenever Rob is ready, he can also impress us with his technical skills and then throw up his screen share. Rob, the floor is yours. And if I could ask everyone to mute if you aren't muted yet.
Thank you very much. I hope I live up to your expectations, and sorry that I've left it so long. I was double booked in this pandemic. It's amazing that two things can happen on the same evening, but they did the last time. So I'm now going to go into the technology and try and get up my screen share and start my slideshow from the beginning. And you should now have another picture of me in my younger years. Is that okay? We all see that okay?
Yep, looks good, Rob.
Okay. Well, as you said, my video was shown at your November meeting, but for those who didn't see it, you'll find a link on the homepage of my own website, and all you have to do is Google whytrident.uk and you'll find it, and look at the text next to my photo. But I'll just briefly recap my time prior to joining the Polaris Force, which is mainly what I'm talking about now. So I joined the submarine service in 1961. And my first patrol was a war patrol as the Cuba crisis unfolded. This is a picture, an aerial shot of the missile silos being installed in Cuba. I was 22 years old and thought it very exciting. The prospect of it resulting in the end of the world didn't really quite register until much later. I then served on a number of diesel submarines based in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, Plymouth, and Singapore, around the world in the days when we had a worldwide navy. In 1969, after serving in 4 submarines, I qualified age 30 as a commanding officer on the Perisher course. I was appointed captain of the diesel-powered submarine HMS Alliance for 2 years. She's now a museum, a little bit like me, and a very visual and important part of the submarine museum in Gosport. She's out in the water, and on the other side, it's got steps and doors cut into the side so you can go around it. Strongly recommended. I was sent on a new nuclear reactor course at Greenwich Naval College after that, which very ironically had a low power reactor called Jason, on which to carry out nuclear training exercises on nuclear power missiles. But of course, Greenwich was a nuclear free zone, as I'm sure most of you knew. But the town council only discovered they had a reactor within the zone when the college applied for approval to shut it down permanently in 1996. I was doing the training so I could be second in command, called the executive officer of the starboard crew of the Polaris Submarine HMS Repulse. We had a starboard crew and a port crew and alternated to maximize the time at sea. The executive officer, or XO as he's known, had to be qualified to command in case the captain fell sick, because the submarine had to remain permanently on patrol, whatever happened. And in fact, I took over twice from my commanding officer when he was ill. Before we became fully operational, we went to the US test range in Florida to fire an unarmed missile 1,500 miles down the ocean. It didn't have, of course, a warhead on. With typical British humour, we stuck a John Bulldog cartoon on the side. I don't think it was the reason, but a minute after launch, the missile swerved off course as a first stage booster released. It was immediately destroyed by a remote signal. The implications, if it had been fired in anger with 300 kiloton nuclear warheads on top going almost anywhere, are self-evident. The three aims of a Polaris patrol, all of equal importance, were firstly always to remain undetected. Secondly, we had to maintain continuous listening communications in case we had a firing signal come in. And we had to be constantly at 15 minutes notice to fire. Wherever we were, whatever we were doing, we had to be able to launch within 15 minutes. Each patrol was about 8 weeks long. Today, they're 3 or 4 months long because we're shorter submarines, which I'll come on to later. And no one except the captain and the navigating officer actually knew where we were.
Rob, can I just ask, that photo that you're showing, is there something like a conning tower visible in the middle?
Ah.
Let's see.
It's not. It just happens to be a wave that broke. I should really probably Photoshop it out, but it looks as if we are being detected, but it's not.
Right. Okay.
There's always one in the audience.
Just checking.
Yeah. But it was always a constant source of speculation based on water temperature and weather conditions above us as to where we were, but no one actually knew. Nor theoretically did anyone ashore in Faslane know when we sailed or returned. But the local butcher and baker might have had a clue when orders for meat and bread started and stopped. This does have problems sometimes, this being constantly out of contact. And on one patrol later, when I sailed, my wife and family were we're going out through the airlock, and there's a little shingle piece called Route Narrows where the families would come and wave us off. And I realized my wife was waving particularly vigorously, very vigorously. In fact, she was waving with 2 hands. In fact, she was gesticulating. And I put my hands in my pockets and found I got the car keys. And I was about to go on patrol for 8 weeks. Fortunately, we had a police escort boat, which we called alongside. He took the keys and she could drive home. Nasty moment in the marriage. But of course, our wives were quite important to us. While we could receive signals and messages, we were not allowed ever to send anyone any signals out because this would reveal our location. But once a week as a morale booster, each crew member received a familygram, a telegram. And this is one from me, from my wife. They consisted of 40 words, which could not be in code or convey bad news. And in fact, the messages were vetted by the other crew ashore. So although they were a morale boost to us, you knew bad news might have been censored out. And one of the worst tasks the support staff had on meeting a returning submarine was to convey any serious news to the unfortunate crew member. Just do a sound check. Am I coming across all right?
Yeah, very good.
Quality, Rob. Very good.
Okay. We lived in quite good comfort, quite a different type of submarine, really. The old days of these smelly diesel submarines were gone, and this is the wardroom mess for 12 to 15 officers, and we had 2 and 4 berth cabins outside for us to sleep in as well, and the captain had his own cabin. And the crew, this is the senior ratings mess, they had space as well. You'll notice that we're wearing uniforms, not the old throwaway clothes we wore in the smelly diesel boats, which after a 6-week patrol were just worth nothing more than to be burnt. We patrolled at very slow speed, trying to be a very silent needle in the haystack, avoiding everything coming our way. So the aim was to have absolutely no excitement at all. So boredom was the biggest enemy. So we all had hobbies, studied for educational qualifications, became export card and board game players, held quizzes and so on. And beard competitions were held, which I definitely did not win. And at Christmas, and I was a patrol over a Christmas period, the crew put on a pantomime, or sod's opera, as the Navy calls them, which occupied lots of time for rehearsals, was extremely scurrilous about everyone, including the captain, and generally was full of lots of in-house jokes of the look behind you kind, referring, of course, to the Russians who are always trying and failing to find and follow us. One of the things you did on patrol was, because of the Russians trying to find you and to check there was nobody behind you, was always to do circles fairly regularly to listen behind you. Well, this particular Christmas patrol, we must have been in the Atlantic, we judged, because there was a storm 10 to 12 up top, and the submarines rolled in bad weather, even deep because they're very round, and we were rolling quite badly, such that lunch would have slid off the table. So the captain, with great reluctance, said he would maintain a steady course for 25 minutes, having done about 6 circles beforehand to make sure we were clear, and he would announce when to put lunch on the table. And he piped, "Hands to lunch." Christmas lunch was served. 25 minutes later, we altered course to check all was clear behind me, and the whole of the Christmas lunch table was finished up in the gutter. Well, I'm sure you're a bit curious to know what it was like to be part of the command team with the responsibility for firing 16 missiles with a total destructive power hundreds of times greater than Hiroshima. Well, we were all very young, and we were trained to obey orders, and we were subject to constant repetition in the press and by security briefings that there was a very real danger of the Soviets invading Europe with the aid of nuclear weapons. We were totally convinced that the concept of mutually assured destruction, mad indeed, would make our retaliation so absolutely unacceptable as to ensure it would never be used. By taking this floating Armageddon to sea, we really thought we were keeping the nuclear peace and would never realistically use it. I'm sorry to say we gave no thought at all about accidental or mistaken use, despite the Dr. Strangelove movie, which we watched on board, as we did watch Neville Shute's book and film On the Beach. In old age and retrospect, I'm ashamed that we did not give this more thought, nor were we given any discussions about the law. But before we went on our first patrol, my captain and I did discuss and agree that if ordered to fire, we would only do so if there were other indications, including BBC radio, which we could listen to 24 hours a day, indications that the Soviets had launched a nuclear attack. If we thought this was not the case, and Radio 2 and the rest of the world seemed to be proceeding normally, we agreed we would not fire, but phone home, very much against the rules. But we said and agreed we were not prepared to carry out a first strike and start a nuclear war. Some, but not all captains thought the same. And a few, I think, had privately resolved they would not fire at all, even if the UK was being attacked. Deterrence, they thought, would have failed, and to fire solely for revenge would not have been sweet. Come the day, my late age in life, I do wonder if we perhaps would not have fired as well. There were some of all ranks who didn't wish to serve in Polaris at all for personal moral reasons. Somewhat unusually, no disciplinary action was taken over anybody who refused to do this. It was seen as a career preference. But actually, their careers came to an end at that point. Nothing official, but they just did not get promoted further. So if you had any qualms about firing, then it would cost you your career. It's a difficult choice for a young man, perhaps with a family to support. In retrospect, and still so today, I think and realize it was just a monstrous nuclear weapons arms race for no reason other than they have nuclear weapons, so we must. We were actually unsuspecting tools in a power struggle between nations in which the Soviets had no intention at all of using their nuclear weapons for invading Europe or anywhere else. And in fact, there is no hindsight intelligence that the Soviets ever planned to attack the West with weapons unless we attacked them first, in which case, if we did, they were fully prepared to retaliate. This is a fact supported by Sir Roderick Braithwaite in his extremely interesting and revealing book about the nuclear arms race, Paranoia and Armageddon. He was our ambassador to the USSR from 1988 to 1992, and then chair of the Joint Intelligence Committee for several years, and so very well placed to know. And if you haven't read his book, I strongly recommend it. Not because he takes up a strong position one way or another, but he just lays out the facts in a long line so firmly and clearly that you don't need him to make an absolute conclusion. The story tells itself. And it's a tough book to read because it's so calm, pragmatic, and factual. A clue, of course, as to what was going on lies in the title, Paranoia. It's just been a massive game of nuclear shadowboxing, which carries on despite all the talk about disarmament being the objective. And that's another interesting fact. Since 1968, when the big five of the US, Russia, UK, France, China, all signed up to the UK UN Non-Proliferation Treaty, there have been no reductions in nuclear weapons or even negotiations to do so at all under this treaty. Which is why, of course, the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons has been created by 122 frustrated non-nuclear weapon states and is now come into force. So in hindsight, I think we were all a victim and still are of government propaganda. I want to unshare at this stage and go back to pause and ask if there's any questions at this stage about the Polaris or being in the submarine. I am going to go on and talk now about why other factors about why I changed my mind and my opinions on nuclear weapon matters or anti-nuclear weapon matters. So if you've got any questions on the sort of submarine side, the experience side, I think this is the opportunity.
So, in other words, Rob is going to be talking about how he had this change of heart and all the military stuff. This is your chance to ask about, you know, what was the food like, or was there a doctor on board, or what happened if someone died? You know, those kinds of questions.
Yeah, it's a chance for me just to give my voice a slight rest and also not to take all the questions at the very end, by which time I'll have forgotten the answers.
Penny.
Yes, I was going to ask, are all the staff heavily vetted psychologically? Because it must be an extremely stressful environment.
No.
No?
No.
I'm amazed.
At the time I joined the submarines, I think it's changed a bit now, at least half the people were drafted into submarines as non-volunteers. I was a non-volunteer. My captain said, Forsyth, your original approach to naval discipline needs a venue better than the surface ships. I think you should go to the more informal atmosphere of submarines. Off you go, you're on a course. But, Sir Rice, he said, don't argue with me, my boy. You're allowed to become a submariner and good luck. Fortunately, it suited me. But before we went to sea, we had no psychological training. nor before we went to see the Polaris Submarine did we have any psychological or legal or conditioning training at all. It was just
Amazing.
another job. But
Gosh.
interestingly, if you take a group of people, 70 to 100 people, who have a common interest of staying afloat and keeping the water out, so they have a keen professional interest in your capability, you all
Right.
have to be good at your job, and you get respect for that. And when
Right,
you have
thank you.
respect, people
you.
will actually overcome the fact they don't like where you slurp your tea or you keep stealing all the Marmite. You know, we become more tolerant.
Lindis, have you got your finger up? You're on mute at the moment. You need to go off mute. Lindis, you're still.
Yes. I think I'm okay now, aren't I?
Yeah, can hear you.
Okay. Hello, Rob.
Hello.
It sounds awfully sort of haphazard whether you fire or not, or whether you did fire or not. And was anything ever written down, or was that just a sort of, you know, this is what we'll do? You won't respond automatically. And
No,
is it,
no.
presumably, I hope it's much tighter now, especially
No,
with Trump out of it.
No, so you misunderstand me. Our patrol orders and the clear understanding was that we would fire, but we understood that we would only fire in retaliation for a nuclear attack.
Yeah.
My captain and I informally agreed, because in the end, the last person who had the capability of not firing is the captain, who has a key which he turns in a console called the permission to fire key, and says, you have my permission to fire. It doesn't actually fire the missile, but it gives permission. It's quite an evocative term. You try turning a key and saying you have permission to fire, and you said, oh, megaton, you know, it's quite a serious moment. So he could refuse to turn the key. If you refuse to turn the key, you could then speculate what might happen. Other people might have tried to turn it for him, I don't know. But we had agreed that we had been sent to sea to fire in retaliation. And if we suspected that we were actually being told to launch a preemptive initial attack, then we wouldn't. We'd phone home to find out why we were being told to do something that was not the same as our brief. Today, and I'll come on to it, I don't want to anticipate what I'm about to say in the second half. I'll answer the rest of your question later.
Thank you.
But listen carefully, because that is very important to me, and it's a key part of why I've changed my mind when I get there.
Thank you.
Do we have, oh, hi, Nigel. Go ahead. You're on mute.
Right, sorted, yes. I wonder, Commander, was there any problems with the nuclear propulsion system while you were on the Polaris submarines? Do you know of any?
Depends what you define by a problem. We had problems that led to having to do work on the nuclear reactor, shutting it down occasionally, things like that. We never had anything in a Polaris boat, as I'm aware of, that would have been what I would call a very serious incident that could have caused a meltdown. Another nuclear submarine did have such an incident, which is documented. HMS Warspite in Liverpool had a fire in the tunnel above the reactor compartment, and a valve was shut by mistake, which meant the emergency cooling wasn't working, and only due to the bravery of one of the engineering staff who went in black smoke with breathing apparatus to open up the correct valve was a meltdown avoided. I mean, it didn't get close to a meltdown, but it would have done if this guy hadn't put his life on the line. That's the only serious one that I know of, but we never had an incident at sea that I know of in Polaris which could have caused the submarine damage.
Thank you.
John, you have a question.
Yes. I'm sure there must have been instances where the pressure just got to them. So how did people cope when someone just had either the stress or the pressure of living on this small boat with this immense destructive ability around you? How do you cope? Because I guess you couldn't just pop up to sea and you know, pop them on the nearest island.
No. Well, the first is we had a doctor who was quite young, still a great friend of mine, my doctor. We were all young and fit, and apart from the occasional accident of bruises or perhaps a broken finger or burns, there was very little wrong with us. You went to sea, and after a week, everybody had everything. Of course, that was pre-COVID, and you all had colds for a week, then we were fine. So there was nothing to complain about, but people would invent reasons to go and talk to the doctor if they were unhappy. And he would act as an agony aunt and listen to them. That was one thing. The other thing is the submariners played lots of games that you play with cards and Ludo and snakes and ladders. But every game depended on cheating. Cheating was the main rule. And you cheated like mad. And if you caught somebody else, you got cross with them. And people could therefore let off steam, being abusive, even to the captain. If he decided to go and play uckers or crib or something with the sailors, which happened, and he was caught out cheating, which you meant to do and not get caught, they would be routed. That was sort of an informal way of doing it. And the other thing is, I didn't keep watches. I'm a second in command. I didn't do watches. I was a non-watch keeper. So round about, I used to get my sleep in during the day, and at night I'd be awake because that's a low time, around 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning at the extremities of the submarine, when people are very quiet and perhaps a bit depressed and so on. I go and chat to people and get a feeling for what they were thinking and doing. So those sort of measures. I only ever knew one person in the whole of my submarine career who got claustrophobia.
Helen, you had your hand up earlier. Has it been answered?
Yes, it has. Thank you. Thank you, Robert.
How are we doing? Any other questions relating to the day-to-day stuff? Rob, do you want to take a couple of minutes break, or are you quite happy now going into the second part of your talk?
I'll move on. Yeah.
You can easily tell us to go away for 2 minutes if you want.
Yeah. Okay. No. If I go away, you'll see me, because I'm not going to, this is live. I'm not going into sharing now. I'm afraid there aren't any pictures for this part. This is philosophy, thinking, and things like that. So after being in Polaris, I got promoted to commander. I became teacher to the perisher course that I passed to become a captain for 2 years, teaching other people how to be captains. I was then given command of HMS Scepter, a hunter-killer nuclear-powered submarine, but didn't have nuclear missiles, just torpedoes, which I drove for 2 years, looking for Russians mainly in the Mediterranean, a lot of that. At the end of that, I was sent off to the Ministry of Defense to drive a desk. And I decided I joined the submarines because I didn't like the big organization. I was a bit more informal than that, perhaps thought too much about things, decided after 2 years there were better things to do. The Navy was shrinking. This was just before the Falklands. And on the basis that the Navy was going to be cut in half, I decided I'd leave the Navy and pursue broader horizons now that I was actually too old to go to sea in submarines anyway. I felt also that I'd missed out on a bigger life by spending 20 years in a tube, much that I'd enjoyed it. Of course, that meant I then spent another 20 years or so with a less subjective view of the world than through a periscope, free of naval discipline and thinking. I finished up actually as marketing and sales director for the Westland Group, who you may recall had a helicopter subsidiary of some notoriety. I arrived there just as it had no helicopter orders and left some years later when it got £20 billion on the books. So I did quite a good job, I think. But it did also introduce me to a whole different world. Well, the Berlin Wall came down during that time, and I sort of assumed that Trident was yesterday's weapon. We wouldn't replace the Vanguard class of submarines. But then there began to be serious talk of doing so with the Dreadnought class that they became. So I started to take a deeper interest as to why. Initially, only into whether we could actually afford it. We didn't seem to have enough frigates to escort one carrier, never mind two, which were being built, nor enough hunter-killer SSNs, nuclear-powered but not nuclear missile submarines, hunter-killers, to keep one at sea on most days. And sometimes, actually, we had no submarines at sea at all, except for the Polaris and the Trident force. For those who follow the Navy history, you'll recall that Nelson famously said, "Was I to die at this moment, want of frigates would be found engraved on my heart." Today he might have added, "and submarines." So I followed the debate in Parliament quite closely. It was a terrible debate. It was high on jingoism, serried rows of MPs wrapping a Union flag around themselves about protecting the nation and prepared to press the nuclear button. I think we can all remember who said that, being prepared to kill 100,000 civilians. But it was noticeably low on any hard facts as to the hows and whys we needed this enormously expensive continuation of Trident into the 2050s or 60s, at which point, note, the US naval plan extends Trident to 2084. So they're not thinking much about disarmament at the moment. And where the US goes, UK always comes behind. There was no intelligent discussion in Parliament at all as to where a weapon system designed solely for mass destruction fitted in with the real world conventional and cyber threats we actually face in 2016 at the time, for which our forces were increasingly poorly equipped to cope with them. It all seemed to be predicated on the rise of some unknown hostile superpower sometime in the future. And I also recall that back in the 1980s, several very senior officers had expressed concern that the cost of replacing Polaris with Trident would severely affect the Navy. Admirals Caspar John, Henry Leach of Falklands fame, and Sandy Woodward, also of Falklands fame, had all expressed strong reservations against it, but politically had been told to shut up. So I decided actually to make a project of it and do some deeper and wider research of my own. And in the course of doing so, found a few surprising facts, which I have to say, CMD will not be surprised by any of them. I've been playing catch up, but now I think I'm on a par with most of them. As a starter, it's not generally known that for the last 25 years, not only have Trident warheads not been targeted, but the missile system as a whole has been stood down at several days' notice to fire. So why, I wondered, are the submarines still continuously at sea 24/7, 365 days a year, if it's going to take several days anyway to resume the alert state? CASD, as it's called, using its acronym, is very expensive, not just financially, but because it requires a wide range of military assets, ships, aircraft, helicopters, minesweepers, and so on, to protect the submarine on patrol. It just doesn't go off on its own. There is a web of security woven around it. And at the moment, HMS Vanguard, Trident boat, is permanently out of commission anyway, with refueling problems to which there doesn't seem to be a solution. So the other boats are now regularly conducting mind-bogglingly long patrols. I mentioned earlier, 4, 5, and I've heard even 6 months. I cannot think, actually, how you can cope in a submarine for 4, 5, or 6 months. You must come back a different person. I am concerned for the people. And do we really need to make them do this? Even if you're a committed deterrer, there is no identified or immediate threat of a bolt from the blue attack, as there was in my day in Polaris, when we were told, wrongly I think, that the Soviets could fire at us at any moment, hence why we were at 15 minutes notice to fire. If there's any crisis develop, it would build up. So I see no reason for being on patrol all the time at all. But the fact is, the cost of Trident is ripping the heart out of the Navy. You're probably familiar with the figures, forgive me for those who know, but just to rehearse, it'll cost 32 billion to build the 4 new dreadnought submarines, to which you can add 10 billion pounds of contingency, which is steadily being eroded, and you can add another 20 billion, which they never talk about, for a whole raft of costs, including new warheads, which are phenomenally expensive, the US-UK program, and the rebuilding of Admiralty weapons establishment. That comes to 72 billion in total, of which the government only ever refers to 32 billion. And on top of that, there's about 3 billion a year, very hard to find out the exact cost, to operate actually operate the submarines for however long they're in commission. So if you take a 30-year life, but it could be 40, you're talking about 100 to 120 billion pounds on top of it, which is why CND come up with their figure of over 200 billion as the ownership cost of Trident. In comparison, we have very few frigates and not enough submarines. But a highly capable frigate costs under 1 billion pounds, and a hunter-killer SSN a little over 1 billion. So you could have a lot of ships and submarines for a conventional warfare for the money that Trident's costing us, which is why we've got too few of them. In the end, it's numbers as much as quality that counts. So the fear is that in a war, we will quickly reach a point at which our conventional force response is exhausted. What do? Do we then go nuclear? Well, it seems that the UK is keeping open the option of using Trident in circumstances that are different to retaliating for an incoming nuclear strike, because current policy is described as one of deliberate ambiguity. And because this rules nothing out, it also means that a preemptive first strike with, say, a single warhead in support of troops deployed abroad might be carried out. Now, when I say that to people, they say, poo-poo, that's rubbish. We never think of doing that. The government says this is a weapon of last resort. We'll only use it to defend ourselves. But in 2002, Secretary of State Jeff Hoon said he was quite prepared to use nuclear weapons to attack Iraq if he thought that they were going to inflict severe damage on our forces, whether with nuclear or chemical weapons. He had that intention. He didn't, thank God. So I thought I might just take a look at what international law has to say about what I would call, and other people do, nuclear war fighting. My research agreed with the conclusions of many international lawyers. The only target one could even remotely consider lawful, if you were going into the realms of remote thinking, is a military one in the middle of the ocean or a desert with no population around it. And you could only do that if the winds are blowing the wrong way, because they might distribute radiation and fallout widely. So I was quite interested to find out how the government could square this circle and unequivocally say, as it regularly does, any use of Trident would always comply with international law. And that is, of course, their response to almost any question in the House of Parliament, in the year-long correspondence I had with them by letter, when they would never answer any of my questions and finally said they didn't want me to write to them again, and questions that I posed through people like Caroline Lucas, who very kindly places questions in Parliament for me. And we always know we'll just get a brush off. The government are brilliant at not answering any question. Well, on the law side, one of the reasons I found that perhaps they said that they would comply with international law is because they manipulate the law. Just going into one small technicality here. In 1977, a protocol called Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions was put in force and negotiated. It was specifically for the protection of civilians in wartime and designed specifically for mass destruction type weapons. During the negotiations, both the UK and the US pressured the International Red Cross, who were chairing the convention, to not define which weapons might breach the rules, but only to define the rules themselves. Fair enough, you might think. Don't say what will breach it, just say the rules, and anything that breaches it, whatever weapon it is or whatever way, is then in conflict with the law. So that's what they did. But then, after the rules have been adopted, the UK and the US both say that these new rules do not apply to nuclear weapons because the convention has not prescribed them. There's a bit of circular legal speciousness that left me breathless. And this blatant misuse of the law proved to be the final turning point in my views. It seemed clear to me that the UK was deliberately using specious legal arguments to justify the use of trident in order to reserve the ability to use it for nuclear war fighting if necessary, and not just for defense of the homeland against a nuclear strike. They've been challenged on this many times, and they will not disavow either Jeff Hoon's statement or answer my questions. They just always come back and say, we have a policy of deliberate ambiguity and we will always comply with the law. But how do you know they're going to comply with the law if it's ambiguous? Interestingly, another retired Trident captain has stated, sorry, just a glass of water. Coming towards the end anyway, but my voice is beginning to fade. Another retired captain stated in the media recently, actually his name's Andrew Corbett, and he wrote an article in the Byline Times in July. And he said he would not press the nuclear button for Boris Johnson because he doesn't trust him. Well, if you don't trust one prime minister, why should you trust any prime minister? How do you know at sea, several hundred feet under the water, 8 weeks out from home, probably, how do you know what the thinking is, what's going on? To me, it just said everything that I say is you cannot put your trust in the prime minister. And a number of US military said they would question an order to fire from Trump because they felt that he could directly order them, but it had to go through a military chain of command, so they could interrupt that fire order if necessary. And that was quite a debate in the press about that. Well, it's a little known fact, about my last fact, that our own Prime Minister makes this decision entirely on his own without any military involvement at all. He used to, in my time in Polaris, the Chief of Defence Staff and the First Sea Lord as an alternate were in the decision chain, and if you had a mad Prime Minister, they could have done something about it or advised him. So nowadays, our own military couldn't stop the transmission of a rogue PM's fire order. Only the captain of the submarine who refused to fire. And he, of course, would put his career entirely on the line, and he probably hadn't got the facts to make any decision. So, taking all these factors into account, and now with the added problem of the nation being weighed down with the massive cost of Brexit and COVID, there is no way that we, not only can we afford a nuclear deterrent, but it's not morally or legally justified either, if it ever was. I've crossed a bridge, and I've written articles for naval journals called The View from the Other Side. I've crossed the bridge from pro to being against it for, I think, quite convincing reasons. And I published these articles, and interestingly, I found a lot of support amongst Navy people, but nobody brave enough to speak out. They all say, well said, Rob, keep on saying it. There are some senior officers who are sympathetic and think I've got a point of view. There is one admiral in particular, Admiral Blackham, who argues the case strongly, not only that we can't afford it, but actually the moral side of it is wrong as well. So there are people who are speaking out, but not enough. I think at that point, I'll pause. I'll say one more thing before I ask for questions, but I think you probably know, I don't know whether this shows up on the screen. Oh no, I'm going to go to, can you see that?
Yep.
Right. For those who want to go to, yep. Those who want to go into it in depth, that's the book that you can find on my website, whytrident.uk, £5.99 from Spokesman Books. All the money goes to the Burton Russell Foundation. I don't take anything. I waive my rights to the money. And that has a much longer explanation and a lot more detail than I've been able to give you tonight.
Rob, thank you ever so much. And now take a pause for 1 minute, because I'd like to just pass over to Jenny. Jenny, if you could unmute and just tell us how many copies have you got of Why Trident and how can people buy them off you?
Oh, you've got some copies, Jenny. Oh, you got some, yeah.
Yes, I've got, yes. First of all, can I say a word about the book from my own point of view? It is highly, I can't recommend it highly enough. It's so well written, Rob, and it's easy to follow. And all your arguments are substantiated with references and all sorts of things. And as I say, I recommend it highly. And I have about, I think I reserved 10 copies for Faringdon Peace Group, actually. Nigel has taken some for Oxford CND, and Kidlington CND have got 2 or 3 on order, but I'm sure I can get some more copies from Rob if we need them, but I have got some available, and I hope you don't mind, Rob, I'm selling them for £5. I think you and I came to an arrangement about what I paid you.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can get any more discounted. They were very generous to me at the start. I think future ones would have to come for £5.99.
So the answer is, if you want your copy at the lowest possible price, to get the order into me as soon as possible. I think that's. What else did you want me to say, Stuart?
No, that's it. Thank you, Jenny. So if people simply email you, would that be okay? Or if you email me and I'll pass it on to Jenny, you've all got my email address.
Yes.
So Rob has very kindly now opened the floor to any questions. I've got a dozen or so scribbled down, but I don't want to abuse my position here. So I might throw them in at the end if they haven't already been asked. Go ahead.
Could I just jump in and say, please feel free to ask any question. Don't be sensitive or think I might be affected or offended by anything. I'm open to any question.
Karen.
We're not on mute. Having read your book, Rob, I found the aunt in Kiev syndrome quite amusing. Do you want to explain to the others what that is?
Yes, we weren't told what the targets were. They were computer controlled and went into them. And officially, we were deliberately not told, on the basis that if we had an aunt in Minsk, we might not fire that particular missile that was going to obliterate Minsk. We would only fire the ones that would obliterate Moscow, Petrograd, and other places. We had an idea. I think there's been so much discussion of the Moscow criterion, having enough missiles to take the whole of Moscow out because it was ringed or had defense missile sites and command posts in it. It was a deliberate policy to obliterate Moscow, civilians and military. But we weren't told that.
Right.
It's difficult to talk about, really. When I sit here at my age talking about it, I think, I cannot think of no better acronym than MAD. But we did at the time. We did think if you make it really bad, nobody will ever do it. And that was sort of our justification. But I must say, as I went in and out of the peace camp, because I was always at the gates, the peace camp at Paz Lane, we all thought that's one way of doing it, but perhaps ours is more practical. I'm not sure now.
Go ahead, Pete. You're on mute.
Not anymore, I'm not. Thank you for that. Ask a couple of questions. Back to, it's not flippant. If there was a change of Prime Minister or Defence Secretary or whatever, would you actually be informed as when you're at sea that Joe Bloggs has been replaced by Fred Smith? And that might affect how you would, informally, of course, decide whether you'd accept Joe Bloggs's press the button or Fred Smith's press the button. That's one question. And the second question, if I may, you talked about when you undergone training, when you were entering into the service, that as it were, the moral side of the service wasn't that of the use of weapons wasn't really discussed. It was assumed if you're in up to there. But do you know if subsequently to your retirement from the service, that in fact there are these debates and discussions about the moral side of warfare, in particular, you know, when you said before about obliterating Moscow, and I don't know how large, how many people live in Moscow, but when you think there must be millions to be slaughtered, was that ever debated and discussed?
Well, there's two venues where it could be. One is officially ashore. I don't think there was much discussion. In my time, there was general acceptance of the fact that the Soviets wanted to take over the world with nuclear weapons, and we had to face them off. That was the view. So there was no need to discuss it. Obvious to anybody. But today, I think there is slightly more discussion, but not very deep. I think at the staff colleges, they do have discussion from outside speakers who may present other views, but I don't think they're very trenchantly presented. I've tried to find out if I could talk in a staff college, but nobody's ever taken up my offer. We did a little bit at sea. I mean, my captain and I had our discussion before we went on our first patrol. Don't think we ever discussed it again at sea, but some of the crew talked about it. But there was a psychology involved. You didn't want to think about it because it was too big. You couldn't think about it. It was, you know, if you let it prey on your mind, you go mad. So one of the attributes of being a submariner was to take out of your head things that would fester. So when you went to sea, you left your normal life behind. You forgot about your family. You had to stop worrying about them. You also had to, perhaps to some extent, stop, because in the Polaris Force, stop worrying about what you might have to do. Otherwise, you might just go mad. So I guess we just didn't think about it deliberately. Well, perhaps not deliberately, psychologically, we didn't think about it. Very few discussions.
Peter, you've put a question in the chat. Do you want me to read it out, or do you want to?
I didn't answer both questions.
Oh, go ahead, Rob.
The first one was about the prime ministerial change. Yes, we were always told of the prime minister change. It's an interesting one. Sorry, I'm diverting slightly into another aspect, and somebody else may bring it up. The letter of last resort. Do people know what I'm talking about when I say the letter of last resort? The instruction, every Trident captain has a safe which he opens if he thinks and believes that the United Kingdom government has been wiped out in a nuclear attack. And each Prime Minister writes a personal letter to each of the commanding officers, which they keep in the safe, and they open it in the event they think there is no UK government who could give them an order to fire, and the Prime Minister is presumed dead. And the letter gives them various options. Nobody knows exactly what's in it. Every prime minister writes their own letter. But it's sort of presumed it either says, fire all your missiles to the last target, and then head off for America or Australia, or do nothing, or something else. Nobody knows. But actually, it's a letter from the Prime Minister who's dead as an order to a captain, and who is only meant to obey orders from a live person who knows what he's doing. So the whole thing is pretty fabulous in the first case. And if the Prime Minister changes, what did he do? Take it out of the thing? Do they email him another? You know, the whole thing is quite ridiculous. It's a PR exercise by the government to distract from bigger issues. I'm not even sure it's lawful. How can you have an order from a dead man that's lawful? And to fire in revenge only to achieve nothing is too late. So, sorry, that's a bit rambling, but I hope I didn't.
Peter Burke,
Thank you for that.
do you want to ask your own question, or do you want me to read it out?
Thank you very much. I can say it. And Robert, it's great to see you, and thank you very much for a really interesting talk. I've really enjoyed it, and I'm sure everybody else has. I just wanted to ask you a little bit about your views on the UK's first strike capability, please. And one of the things that we're kind of constantly told by politicians and the media is that the UK has its own independent nuclear deterrent. Now, actually, that's not the case, because under the terms of the 1962 Nassau Agreement, which was the agreement under which President Kennedy first agreed to give the United Kingdom the Polaris weapons system, the arrangement was that the nuclear weapons that the UK would take from the States would be assigned for NATO use, and only in the most extreme circumstances could be used independently. So that basically means that despite everything we're told about them being British nuclear weapons and sort of British independent, they're not actually. They're really NATO nuclear weapons. And that has implications, I think, for first strike policy, because probably, as everybody knows, NATO has a first strike nuclear policy. But whereas with our, 40 odd nuclear weapons in a strike fired at, say, Russia, that's really, if we were to ever use them in a first strike capability, all we will be doing would be inviting massive retaliation against ourselves for no great purposes. If we were to undertake a first strike as part of a NATO strike in association with US forces, then that could actually be a meaningful act of war aimed at sort of getting rid of a competitor. So I just wondered whether you had any thoughts on that, and anything more that you'd like to say about that whole NATO angle, perhaps.
Well, it's a big question. Just trying to think, you've half answered it yourself, I think, Peter, in your excellent summary of it. First of all, I don't think we are independent. They say we're independent, but actually in the United States, we got a US weapons system, and it's got America written all over it all the way through. The only difference between a Trident submarine, Vanguard, and the Columbia class, which are going to match the dreadnoughts, is that we have alcohol on board and they don't. And we have our own nuclear propulsion reactor different to theirs. But the weapons system and everything that goes with it is identical. In fact, we are building the missile tube for the Columbia class, which are the same as the dreadnoughts. And everything, including the warheads, is not generally known, but I think it's become apparent with this US-UK agreement on warheads that I think the only bit of the warhead we will build is a thing called the nuclear explosive package, and that will be actually a carbon copy of the American one anyway. And they're involved in targeting, they're in the loop. They write the software for targeting, they have all the software for how the systems work. They permeate every bit of it. So while technically you could actually press a button and fire a missile from a British submarine without American approval, if there was quickly before they had time to do anything, but if America did not wish us to, they have all the tools to stop us. You borrow the missiles from America, the warheads are going to be joint, the systems are joint, or it's American. So they could stop us. The missile, the system is part of, declared to NATO, because I think that was at the time a way to get the Americans to let us have it. It does, of course, complicate the decision making, which may be good. To do a first strike on behalf of NATO, trying to get NATO to come to a decision might be a laborious affair, which might be one of our protections. But I personally think that first strike is a real possibility, but the UK technically could carry out its own first strike. If for instance, we wanted to fire a missile at Iraq, if the Americans have got wind of it, a bit like Egypt and the Canal War, I think they could stop us. We couldn't do anything really without American support. So our savior might be, theoretically they could do it, but in practical terms, somebody might be able to stop us, and I would be quite pleased with that. If the one thing sometimes in a campaign, you have to have a narrow focus, and while getting rid of nuclear weapons completely should be the aim, as a big aim, on a very narrow front, if we could actually get the UK to forswear first use and say that Trident is only for defense against an incoming nuclear attack, that would unbelievably be a step forward. Because the chances of somebody firing nuclear weapons at us is small, and we would first strike. So we just have a very expensive piece of kit, not really needing it. But that would be my aim. My focused aim is to try and get rid of first strike and to have sole use, as it's called. Sorry, did that answer, Peter? Or?
Thank you. Yes, that's very interesting. I appreciate the answer. Thank you.
I'm very much aware of Rob's voice. So
it's okay.
Are you sure?
Don't worry.
Thank you. Maybe if I could throw in a little question. You mentioned that, and you felt a bit guilty about it, that you really weren't thinking about nuclear accidents, even though you were watching Dr. Strangelove on board. There's other films that have come out since then that I'm thinking of things like War Games or Chaos Theory in Jurassic Park. What are your views now on the possibility of genuinely an accident against all the odds, if you like?
Well, I'm grown up enough to think that it could happen. At the time, with your military and you're well trained and well organized, of course, you can't conceive of making mistakes, and you may do all of this work to make sure you don't make mistakes. But life is not like that. In older age, looking back on it with a broader vision, mistakes are entirely possible. I think numbers count. I think a mistake from Russia or America has to be higher than from us. I'm not being British about it. If you've only got one submarine with 8 missiles on board, the chances of an accidental use has to be significantly less. Chatham House published a report on, 12 or 14 near misses over the last 30 years, which is quite an interesting report, which actually when serving, I probably was completely unaware. Nobody told us about that. You find out otherwise when you're not in the service. And recently, of course, or fairly recently, there was the incident in Hawaii when a nuclear alarm was falsely triggered, and they thought it was an incoming missile, but it actually was a false alarm. A siren went off, a warning siren went off. Unfortunately, nobody reacted to it, but it must have been quite close for a local commander, because power to fire is delegated quite a long way down the chain sometimes for certain set circumstances. If something happens and a missile is coming and there is a nuclear warning, then some places are instructed to fire. They don't wait for the command from the top.
Thank you.
as far as I'm thinking of nuclear accidents, sort of cool port wise and things, it's interesting that there's been quite a lot of talk about safety and the cool port area and the range that things have to be at, both for nuclear safety and environmental safety and explosive safety. When you talk about perhaps the missiles being shifted out of Scotland to the rest of the UK, they're having great trouble finding anywhere to put them because they're too close to populations. And the Gairloch, of course, is close to a population, a fact which seems to be ignored all the time. It's just down the road from Glasgow. I know it because it takes 30 minutes with no traffic.
You did mention that many of your colleagues in the military have been quite supportive in your change of heart, but have you also lost friends, or are there people that you need to be slightly careful in terms of, talking with them about certain subjects, that you have to tread on eggshells?
No, interestingly, I think I've got some quite strong opponents, people who speak their mind and probably behind my back probably quite rude about me, but still talk to me. So Mariners are a fairly tolerant lot, and it's difficult to knock. I'll just sort of huff myself slightly here. I had a fairly distinguished submarine career, and part of it was being teacher. And there is a teacher is a position that's much respected in submarines. And I drove a nuclear submarine. And actually, it's quite difficult to be rude about somebody who's got that sort of track record. So they have to be cautious. I'm not a fool.
Thank you. Jenny, did you want to ask something?
Yes, I did. One, two sort of allied questions, I think. One is to do with the 5 original nuclear weapons states. You have a theory, I think, Rob, as to why Britain seems to want to hold on to, excuse me, I've got to shut this door. As to why Britain seems to want to hold on to its nuclear weapons when not even ours anyway, as you said.
Yeah, I think it's quite
something to do with France, I believe.
Well, there's two things. One is, yes, an inbuilt resentment if France was the only nuclear weapon power in Europe, although French nuclear missiles are not dedicated to NATO, like the UK ones are. But there's sort of an image, the old Anglo-French rivalry. But the bigger reason is just to remain a first-tier military power, to play on the big stage, for Boris to be able to stand next to whoever happened to be president, to be a member of the Security Council. Ironically, you don't have to be a nuclear power to be a member of the Security Council. If we decided to disarm, we'd still say stay a member of the Security Council, because that was formed after the Second World War and we were part of the Allies winning. So that's secured by that. Nothing to do with nuclear power at all, but it's put about as a reason. But it's all about keeping up with the American Joneses mainly, because, to be honest, compared with America, our influence is quite small nuclear-wise. It's just to maintain a big image. Power politics.
The ironic thing, I think, if I can just come back briefly, is that we're spending all this money on this tremendous weapon that we'll probably never use, billions and billions of pounds. Meanwhile, we've lost, is it 100,000 people to a minute virus that we can't cope with, and we haven't got the money to really deal with that properly. So that the two things seem to me to be completely ironic. The whole situation is mad.
Yeah, no, it's mad. It makes me cross, really cross, that we should be spending money on something as nebulous as this when there are much more serious matters to address. Yeah.
Karen.
Yes, you said that you've always sort of hit a brick wall within the MOD in correspondence with them. Have you found anyone sort of unofficially within the MOD who you can discuss things with, or who has shown any sort of sympathy, or is it an absolutely solid brick wall?
Not anybody who's serving. There is one senior officer who lives 3-4 miles away, and prior to 2016-17, he's a submariner, and we said we ought to meet up in a pub and have a chat. Not a hope. He's been told to keep steer clear of me.
Really?
Almost certainly. I am in touch with 1 or 2 retired ones who've been in the nuclear policy department and targeting and things like that, which I have quite robust discussions. One of them does quite a lot of consultancy for the Ministry of Defence under the MPT. And he is inclined to support the no first use and sole use, but is a firm advocate of having a deterrent. So we agree on that, but we fiercely disagree on the whole concept of deterrence. And it was him who told me categorically that the Prime Minister there is no military involved in the decision to fire today. It's changed. So he told me that.
Peter Gloins, you had your hand up. Are you trying to find the unmute? The space bar will work to temporarily unmute.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. We're becoming increasingly interested and aware of the link between civil nuclear power and the military use of nuclear power. And has been said that the military couldn't really sustain its nuclear power without the continuous feed of engineering expertise from the civil nuclear sector. And I wondered if you had any comment on that.
I think obviously there is quite a crossover. Well, you know, I think the civil sector does a lot of research on which I'm sure the military build. I'm sure there is cross-pollination of people moving from one to the other. Funnily enough, I'd have thought that people leaving the military, having been nuclear trained in the military, moving into the civil sector, supported the civil sector rather more than the other way. There has been enormous pressure on the Trident submarines, quite a lot of morale problems, spending too long at sea, not seeing their families, and one thing or another, and they have been losing trained nuclear engineers to the civil sector for some time now. And they pay a pretty heavy bounty to nuclear engineers not to leave the service, or anybody joining gets a bounty as well, I think. So it's actually a leak the other way at the moment. But there is obviously a crossover. The fundamentals of nuclear power apply whether it's civil or military. Of course, we have actually probably got more former nuclear submarines lying in Plymouth or Rosyth than we actually have ships at sea at the moment, waiting to be decommissioned. They've made a start, but it's pretty slow.
Good. Caroline.
Rob, fantastic talk, and you're so knowledgeable, and I'm very, very privileged to be listening to you. I remember back in the 1980s that James Thompson and Margaret Ballard did a lot of research on the abuse of drugs, particularly on US nuclear submarines. And I wondered whether or not you'd like to comment. You said that on US submarines, they don't have alcohol, but on the British submarines, you do allow alcohol. which I find is quite remarkable. But apparently there were congressional papers that revealed that drugs abuse in these situations was quite widespread, and it brought about possible accidents, risky behavior and things of that kind. Do you have any comments on that?
Yes, I think certainly in my time, I won't say there wasn't some abuse of alcohol. There were occasions when we limited how much drink. When I say we had a bar, there was a limit on how much people were allowed to have. It wasn't unlimited. 2 cans of beer a day was what the ship's company were entitled to. And in the wardroom, we had a can of beer and a glass of wine. So, and you couldn't have it if you were going to go and watch. This is after the tot was stopped. Prior to stopping the rum tot, which happened about the time the Polaris Submarine went to sea, people said they thought it inappropriate to offer people about that much rum in a glass and tell them to drink it in one go, witness to make sure they didn't take it and hide it anywhere. And so you had people who were drunk, who couldn't go and watch. So you couldn't have your tot if you were about to go and watch. But 2 or 3 hours later, you might still be under the weather. Now that was quite wrong. So the tot was stopped. That was worse than the 2 cans of beer. I'm sure there were people who stored a bit of booze and probably had a bit too much, but it was not sufficient ever to cause a concern. You quickly became aware of it. You could ring fence it and control it, and you become habitual. I'm trying hard not to say in my day, but it has changed. I mean, all we got to do is read the press. There is cases of drug abuse, sexual relations, which of course didn't exist in my day at all, no women at sea. Homosexuality existed, but didn't cause a problem. It was tolerated. We just tolerated officially wrong, but providing nobody drew attention to themselves, and actually in the submarine it's quite difficult. These things were tolerated and life carried on quite smoothly, but we seem to have moved beyond that now, that actually there have been documented cases of drug abuse, alcohol abuse, and sexual relations with different sex. So clearly something has slipped, which worries me.
It's around this time that we take a show of hands for tea and coffee, and then we say, right, final few questions for the speaker. So we're going to take just one more question, and then we're going to let Rob rest his voice. Anyone for a last burning question? Otherwise, I'm going to slip another one in. Jenny. Sorry, you're on mute, Jenny.
Sorry about that. I've been involved with the peace movement for a very long time, and I remember demonstrations against Polaris, and I wonder how aware the sailors on the Polaris submarines were aware of the campaigns, usually organised by CND, of course, how aware they were of what was happening back on land in that respect.
I think we were aware. As I said, every time you went through the gates at Faz Lane Naval Base, the peace camp was there. I can't remember it not being there.
That was the peace camp, but what about the demonstrations?
Yes, we read the papers, got the news, we knew all about Greenham Common, and knew the demonstrations were taking place, yeah. And still do. I mean, there was a 50th anniversary service in Westminster Abbey, which I personally found quite difficult to support. For all sorts of people from the Prince of Wales downwards turned up to celebrate 50 years of Polaris and Trident patrols. CND were very active. So, but somewhere along the line, though, the impetus slightly has gone off CND. It's not as high profile as it used to be. I think I think there is an equivalent situation with getting rid of slavery. There was strong political support, financial support, and slaves were part of life, and you couldn't possibly change it. But along comes two very charismatic characters, Wilberforce, and I've forgotten the other person who never gets the credit, who had tremendous charisma and managed to get things moving, got people supported. We need a Wilberforce. Popular opinion, governments only change when they realize they're losing votes. And you have to make it a vote loser. And the vote loser is that actually people are losing out on social benefits and the safety of the country. Defense of the realm is threatened by Trident because the money being spent on an esoteric, perhaps in the future, nuclear war, which may or may not happen. And all that money could be going to pay the cost of Brexit, pay the cost of COVID, and all sorts of social things. We need a big figure to make that statement and get people behind them.
Can I just say, Bruce Kent was the man.
Bruce was the man.
Absolutely.
Did he join us in the end? Because I saw he was trying to join us. I had the privilege of meeting him.
Here. He was here in the meeting, I think, at one time. But
yeah, no, we need a Bruce Kent, to be honest.
Yeah.
And the other thing that worries me, if I can be honest, having now spent some years of this, is there are a lot of individual organizations all pursuing similar aims, but the government divides and conquers. It's not a cohesive single force threatening the government. That's a role the Labour Party should pick up, really.
Well, Rob, on that note, for me, and I think for everyone else, it's been absolutely fascinating and fantastically interesting, extremely well prepared too. We really appreciate it. We know that we can follow up by looking at the reading the book that you put together, which is also extremely useful. But we would all like to express our appreciation for your invaluable contribution this evening. Thank you very much indeed, Rob.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you in person one day.
One day, yes, one day. Well, everyone, we'll sign off now, and until the next time. The video will be made available, by the way, if you do want to send the link to other people that you know who you think might have wanted to attend the meeting.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you.